This week on Talking Politics.
You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
This is just extraordinary.
I mean, a lot of it is not true.
The Trump victory is threatening to the security of our continent.
Things have changed significantly.
My view is it's a bit too soon to know what happens.
I think there is a degree of uncertainty now.
A lot of it boils down to trust.
Does it fundamentally matter?
Oh, God.
It is catching people out all over the world.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Paul Brand, standing in for Tom this week, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by ITV News' international editor, Emma Murphy, making her debut on Talking Politics. Emma, great to have you here. How are you doing?
Good, Paul. Thank you. Busy week.
Absolutely. And Robert is out of the office today, but still with us remotely. Robert, good to see you too. How are you enjoying parliamentary recess?
It never feels like a recess with Donald Trump in the White House.
There's no holiday for a journalist for the next 4 years. Right, before we begin, we should probably mention that next week on the show we'll be answering some of your questions. So please do keep sending them in. talkingpolitics@itv.com is the address. And leave your comments on social media too. We will do our best to tackle them. Now, there is only one place to start, as we've already reflected on, and that is Ukraine this week and the rapidly developing situation over attempts to end the war there. We've had the remarkable sight of Russian and American officials meeting in Saudi Arabia in a bid to start that peace process without any Ukrainian representatives in the room. This has all come about after Donald Trump reached out to Vladimir Putin. And on Tuesday at Mar-a-Lago, he made some extraordinary claims at a press conference. So let's have a listen to those.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed and no city would have been demolished.
We've also had some reaction from Ukraine's President Zelenskyy to that press conference, saying that the US has helped Putin come out of isolation and that President Trump is living in a bubble of disinformation. Emma, I think we should start with you on this one. I mean, bubble of disinformation, I think sounds like a fair assessment. When we watched that press conference together last night, I mean, you and I couldn't really believe what President Trump was coming out with. And some of it is, I think we should say, not true.
No, factually inaccurate would probably be the kindest way to describe the words that he spoke. I mean, a lot of it is not true. A lot of it is incredibly damaging. A lot of it speaks volumes as to the future of Ukraine. When he said last night that Ukraine have been in the seat for 3 years in that war, that's actually wrong, because that is a war that began at 2014. And if you think about what's gone on since then, he was actually in his first administration during at least 4 years of that war. Now, it might have been much more in the east and not hitting Kyiv and the other parts of the country then, but it was in operation. He didn't stop it at that point. And I think, the most shocking of the claims that he made in that press conference was that Ukraine shouldn't have started it in the first place. And that is something that is patently not accurate.
They were illegally invaded by Russia.
That was the first incursion back in 2014. I think there is great consternation, not just about what he says, but what it means going forward. In some ways, they're kind of used to the bluff and bluster of politicians who've offered support, they're not offered support. The Ukrainians are pretty smart when it comes to reading between the lines, but actually on this one now, there is a real worry. There's a sense that they're being sold down the river. And you said there about Zelenskyy's comments about Trump being in this sort of bubble of disinformation. I think it's more serious than that, because when you talk about a bubble of disinformation, it sounds like you've got lots of sources of information that are maybe affecting your view. I think this is slightly more specific. I think this is a president who has been speaking directly to another president who has a polar opposite position from the Ukrainians, and that is the information he's taking. And that is the great concern here, that the narrative that Trump is listening to is a Russian one. And what's been said about Trump during his first administration is he's the kind of person, the kind of leader that will go with what the last person told him in a conversation. And it seems that the conversation he's holding on to here is the one that has been spoken by Vladimir Putin. And I think of all the people in the world at this point, the one that must be really rubbing his hands and thinking, hold on a minute, this is all coming together rather nicely, is Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and there's so much pressure on President Zelenskyy of Ukraine, of course, in the meantime. And you interviewed him very recently. I mean, he was attacked personally by President Trump last night. There were these false accusations that his approval ratings are, 4%, when actually they're more like 50% in Ukraine. How is he holding up in all of this? What kind of demeanour did you sort of sense from him when you saw him the other week? Because in some of the pictures we've seen, he looks quite deflated, quite tired, quite irritable.
Well, he's been at war for 3 years.
Yeah.
I think anybody would be tired and potentially irritable. I don't think that's the kind of conversation that the Ukrainians will, certainly not Zelenskyy, will ever countenance. His view is, I'm the leader of a country at war. The people that are suffering are the people who are fighting this war in the trenches, suffering in great numbers and either dying or being very badly harmed. You talk there about the elections, and one of the things that President Putin has said over and over is that Ukraine should be having elections now, and that those claims have been repeated in the last few days by President Trump. Well, I asked him directly about that, and he said, well, we can't have elections. We're in a state of martial law because we are at war. And one of the big issues for them is, how do they hold elections when you've got, tens of thousands serving, you've got millions out of the country who have been displaced by this war, and also martial law actually bans the holding of elections in this situation. Furthermore, there is a great fear that if those elections were to be held, there would be a move by Russia to A, oust Zelenskyy, without question, they want to do that, but B, put in somebody who is much more sympathetic to the Russian position, at which point everything shifts and the direction that Ukraine is facing will shift from more westerly to more Russian-facing.
Yeah, and Russia, of course, has a track record of doing that in other countries where it has more influence. And Robert, Emma was saying that one of the issues with President Trump is he tends to sound as though he's listened to the last person he spoke to. He's going to talk to Keir Starmer next week. Our Prime Minister is in an extraordinary position here, sort of sandwiched between, well, he hopes, I think at least he hopes that he's sandwiched between Europe and America. How do you think he's going to play this conversation with Trump when he goes over to Washington next week?
So the British have desperately tried not to alienate Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump has been making a whole succession of policy decisions and statements that are totally at odds with the Keir Starmer Labour government position. The big judgment for Keir Starmer is whether he needs at a certain moment to show that in the end, the European interest trumps this requirement to have a so-called friendly, constructive relationship with America, because we should be under no illusion that a Trump victory or perceived victory in Ukraine is threatening to the security of our continent. The interesting question for me is whether or not Keir Starmer will now decide to try and show European leadership. It was quite interesting that after after Trump's dramatic intervention in trying to forge some kind of a deal with Putin, that extraordinary 90-minute conversation with Putin, it was President Macron of France who convened that meeting of European leaders. Some would argue that this is a role that Britain should be playing, this convening power, given that the British government is A, more stable than any other of the major governments that you can think of, and B, apart from France, has the biggest military in the European space, including a nuclear capability, which again only France has. And so for me, the really interesting question is, will Keir Starmer in the coming days, as we all become increasingly concerned that Europe's security is being threatened by what Trump is proposing, will Starmer at that point show that leadership that Europe badly needs?
I suppose there's also a question as well, aside from the security and the economic concerns around moral leadership, right? If America's values are now diverging from Britain and European values, is Starmer going to call him out? It was awkward for Theresa May, and I'm sure you'll remember back in 2016, I think, wasn't it, when she met President Trump? Might have been 2017 by the time she got over there. There was that shot of her holding hands with him and all of the awkwardness around that. How does she, as a female leader, deal with a man who didn't have a great track record of the way that he treated women? Was she going to call him out about his moral background? Is Keir Starmer going to call out President Trump about any of the disinformation that he's spreading?
So I don't know whether Starmer needs to explicitly call him out, explicitly attack him. What Keir Starmer needs to do is very clearly express the security requirements of Europe and very clearly express the his support for the astonishing actual sacrifices that the Ukrainian people have made, not only to protect their own independence, but also, frankly, as a buffer for the whole of Europe. We should be under no illusion that Putin is not just a threat to Ukraine, he is a threat to the security and the integrity of our continent. And up to now, we've been in this incredibly privileged position that our soldiers have not been losing their lives, that the appalling losses have all focused on the Ukrainian military. And I just think that Starmer, Foreign Secretary David Lammy, cannot, frankly, express this position too many times in public, in conversation with President Trump. They don't have to say to Trump, you've just, lied about whose fault this is. They just have to state the truth. The truth is that this was an illegal invasion by Putin, and Zelensky's defense of his nation is a defense of Europe and the West.
And Emma, should we expect this to be a permanent shift now in the world order? I mean, I suppose some people might be wondering, well, President Trump's only going to be president for 4 years. Things might swing back the other way if a Democratic candidate won the next election in America, for example. Or do you think this is more fundamental now, that these are irreversible changes potentially on the world stage, and we should all get used to the tectonic plates shifting?
I certainly don't think that President Trump is in an island on his own with a lot of these views. There will be a lot of people that will share them. And in terms of his wider picture of global order, America first, what America's position should be in the world, I think that he now has probably a greater deal of support for that than he had in that first administration. And I think that is probably suggestive of what we've got ahead, that actually things have changed. Things have changed significantly and probably in a way that is not going to shift back at any time soon. I was just reflecting this morning. President Trump has only been in power just under a month. And if you think what's happened in the space of 1 month, never mind the space of the last 24 hours, what can happen in the next 3 years and 11 months is anybody's guess. But I think without question, there will be seismic change, there will be shifts that we do not see reversed, and there will be a real reassessment of the global world order. And to a certain extent, there probably has to be. And I think that there are points of truth that Donald Trump speaks when he says about Europe and its responsibility to provide its own defence, to spend more on defence spending. Yeah, he's got a valid point there, and I don't think anybody's trying to dismiss that, but whether they're willing to actually match it at the level that he wants is a different thing. And the problem with this, and I think it's the problem that we've seen with a lot of Donald Trump's comments and positions over the last administration and the start of this, is that there are some very valid points in what he says at times, but then there are others that people go, I really can't go along with that. And that, is the really very significant issue. Just thinking back to the Ukrainian position on all of this, when we were over there just the other week and speaking with Zelenskyy, one of the questions I asked him is, if President Trump comes up with something that is just unpalatable to you, if it's just not something you can go with, where do you go from there? Because, of course, America and must be pointed out, Europe and European institutions have been the biggest sponsors of this war. They have been the greatest support. Not America, not the greatest, despite what is claimed. But what do you do if there's this big rift that you can't get round? And he kind of visibly went back in his seat and said, I don't even want to think about that, because he knows how catastrophic that is for Ukraine's position. And I think that he is going to have to tread an even finer line now, because he's under direct attack from Trump at this point. He wasn't then, and he didn't want to criticise, and he's now trying to find that path that refutes what Trump is saying without completely alienating one of his main allies.
And just lastly now, the opportunity appears to be all Russia's. We've completely moved from a situation where Russia, in theory, should have been the weaker partner in a way at this negotiating table. Their economy is in the doldrums. Putin is, if not openly criticised at home, certainly there must be rumblings in Russian households about the way the war is going, if indeed they have enough information to understand the truth of it. In theory, he was going to be the weaker party in all of this, and yet he's come to these negotiations having to offer absolutely no concessions whatsoever, nothing at all, in order to even begin these talks. And you've got to assume that he's going to emerge now in a much stronger position.
Yeah, 2 points before we get into that wider issue. I think we need to be careful about assuming that the Russian economy is too much in the doldrums. I don't think this war has been too bad. The sanctions have not been as devastating as those who imposed them might have hoped for. They are on a pretty strong war footing. They are producing. And also in terms of that dissatisfaction with Putin, I'm sure there are rumblings, but it's not likely to be enough at this point to really unseat him or do him any great harm. And now, this is playing into his hands. This is absolutely perfect. Yes, you're right. He should have gone into this as the weaker party, but he isn't. He's going into this in a really strong position, because these people who say that they are the great deal makers and that they're going to be also peacemakers have gone in and said already, before anything happens, well, yes, there will be territorial losses to Ukraine. No, Ukraine won't be able to join NATO. Yes, we will think about where we have American troops and all those kind of issues that have been absolutely at the heart of Russia's objections. And so, the Ukrainians must be sitting there thinking, this man is giving away our position left, right and centre. He's giving away our land. He wants our minerals. Where do we go from here? And they have every reason to be incredibly concerned. There's no sign that Russia are on the back foot here. I think the person who's winning over everybody at this point is Putin, and he must be absolutely delighted. And when he comes to meet with Donald Trump, what a fascinating moment to see those two men. We didn't get any handshakes yesterday between the American and the Russian delegations. It will be fascinating to see whether there is that photo opportunity. I think there will be.
This is just extraordinary. Here is Putin, who is accused of war crimes, and yet we have, Washington, the American president, the Secretary of State, talking with relish about the commercial opportunities for America of bringing Russia back into the commercial fold.
We're doing the talking, but we want you to ask the questions. So email talkingpolitics@itv.com to make sure we're focusing on what matters most to you. We want to move on now to another important subject here in the UK, the Assisted Dying Bill, which is currently attempting to make its way through Parliament. Labour MP Kim Leadbeater's proposals got an initial backing from MPs in November, but are now under intense scrutiny over changes to the bill, most notably the ditching of plans to involve a High Court judge, and instead hand the decision for approving applications to an expert panel made up of a social worker, a psychiatrist and some kind of legal expert, possibly a retired judge or a KC. Now, Robert, I'm interested to get your view on where this leaves the bill, because there's been a lot of furore this week. There have been a lot of claims in newspapers that this is going to scupper the bill. Opponents of the bill, of course, have seized on it to make their case that there hasn't been enough time in Parliament, not enough scrutiny, the bill's being rushed, etc. Actually, I haven't seen that many MPs named as having changed their minds. My view is it's a bit too soon to know what happens, but what's your view?
Look, I agree with you that forecasting whether this gets through is currently a mug's game, but there is no question that Kem Leadbeater's proposed change to the system for authorising an individual case of assisted dying has unsettled a lot of people. There are fairly significant numbers of MPs who voted for the legislation, but with a degree of anxiety, and many of those, said they were voting for the bill because they felt that it was important to have further debate. They didn't quite like the structure of what had been proposed, but they were confident that the bill could be improved. I think some of those are now questioning whether or not they need to reverse their support and now vote again. So, we are in a position where I don't, whereas after the first vote, if you'd asked me, I'd have said I was pretty confident the bill was going to pass and we were going to be in this new era of legalised assisted dying. Actually, I'm not confident about that, Paul, at the moment. I think there is a degree of uncertainty now.
Yeah, I think it's far less likely than it was in November. I agree with you on that. I suppose Kim Leadbeater had no choice, really, because we heard so many expert witnesses during the week of oral evidence that the committee behind the bill took a couple of weeks ago, saying the High Court element just isn't workable and it'll overburden the courts. There aren't enough judges to go round. She had to ditch it somehow, and it's just whether she can persuade MPs that actually a panel made up of a social worker and a psychiatrist plus some kind of legal expert is, in a way, more safe, because you've got more people with more layers of expertise considering everything from each particular angle.
But there are issues. Sorry, just very, very briefly on that. It's not just whether or not it's a safer set of protections or a more reliable set of protections. It's also whether you're actually going to be able to recruit enough of these people.
Emma, in terms of the international picture here, it's kind of an interesting question whether if the UK or England and Wales in this scenario don't go ahead and legalise assisted dying, whether we sort of become the outlier globally eventually, because the direction of travel globally has been in favour of assisted dying. We've had Australia, New Zealand in recent years legalise it, Canada, although controversially there. You covered Belgium, I think it was,
yeah.
when they changed the law there.
Belgium back in 2014, and actually that was for the assisted dying for children, which was obviously very controversial. But Belgium has always been ahead of the curve in terms of the issue of assisted dying. It has been one of those countries that has led the way. I think it was the first, actually, to put it in Europe. And globally, I mean, 300 million people have access to an assisted death should they choose that. So yeah, the UK is one nation that is not. I mean, you've got 9 European nations who are, including Italy, if you were to think about that country with the whole religious impact of the debate they have. And I think one of the interesting things I remember from Belgium was that the tone and the emotion of the discussion was very different from what I've seen in this country, because they had assisted dying already in place and then they were moving it to minors. And you would have thought that that could have been an incredibly impassioned, incredibly emotional discussion. And it was far calmer than the discussions that I'd heard about the early stages in the UK and those very early discussions about it, because I mean, that is over 10 years, 13 years ago now. Yeah. And I think that there is a different approach altogether. And that's not something that I've seen reflected here, the kind of calmer debate.
Robert, most of the other jurisdictions around the world don't have this kind of third tier, this judicial sign-off or expert panel sign-off. Most of them just require the sign-off of doctors. Do you think maybe there's something culturally here that makes us squeamish about assisted dying in comparison to other countries? Why do you think we want to be so much more cautious about it than other nations have been?
I think partly it's because as a nation, one of the really sort of pernicious things I would argue that's happened over the last 20, 30 years is the collapse of trust. You know, one of the big explosive conversations in the UK this week has been around the criticism that Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch both made at last week's Prime Minister's questions about the role of the judiciary and a particular case where they both alleged that somehow the courts had allowed Gazan refugees to come to the UK against the will of Parliament. And, you then heard, a very senior judge attacking them both for the way that she said that, they were undermining an incredibly important part of our system, the judiciary. I personally see the assisted dying mistrust in this country as very much connected to the decline that we have in trust in each other and trust in our institutions.
You're listening to Talking Politics. Hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. We're going to talk about CVs. Don't worry, Robert, Emma, we haven't checked your CVs. It's not a job interview. But the Chancellor, of course, Rachel Reeves, has been facing some awkward questions about possible exaggerations on her CV. This was her being asked about the issue on ITV's Good Morning Britain a couple of weeks ago. Let's have a listen.
Why did you say that you'd worked at the Bank of England for a decade when in fact it wasn't even 6 years, it was 5? I mean, that's exaggeration, isn't it?
Well, I worked at the Bank of England for 6 years, between 2000 and 2006. I was employed by the Bank of England, including I spent just over a year at the British Embassy working in the economics section there, supporting the government and the bank.
Why did you say it was a decade?
Well, I think it's one interview.
All right, well, the latest accusations now, just to bring you up to date, are that Rachel Reeves claimed to have had an article published in the Journal of Political Economy. Robert's already got his head in his hands. It was the European Journal of Political Economy, which I'm told is not quite such a prestigious publication. And also now there are claims about Jonathan Reynolds too, and whether he was claiming to be a solicitor when he wasn't technically a solicitor, and all sorts of things. Robert, I suppose the question is, does it fundamentally matter, this, do you think?
Oh, God. I mean, what do I think? I think what we should mostly care about with those who hold, important public positions is that they're competent. There's a really interesting... Look, it is very, very odd. I choose my words carefully. That, there's been a whole succession of charges laid at Rachel Reeves' door about... just not being accurate enough, in terms of her personal, whether it's her CV, where there have been a number of allegations that she just got wrong, how long she was at different institutions like the Bank of England. There was also been accusations that she mischaracterized her subsequent job at a commercial bank. HBOS, you will remember that when she published a book not that long ago, she was accused of plagiarism, that a big chunk of it, the claim was just lifted from Wikipedia. It looks sloppy. I have to say the problem that she's got, look, we all, I'm sure, in our lives make mistakes, whether it's on, in her case, Who's Who or LinkedIn, we all make sloppy errors. I suppose the thing that is just odd is there seem to have been so many of these things over a period of years. Her office keeps saying, oh, well, it was an official or some kind of, person doing it for her that made the mistake. I have to say, one of the things that I always find slightly depressing about situations like this is, senior people sort of briefing that it's the junior person who's at fault. This sort of awful junior heads must roll when there's an embarrassment of this sort. She's a busy person. I personally take the view that what matters more is whether she's up to the job. But in politics, I'm sort of if I'm honest with you, particularly after the first allegations were made against her, I'm slightly amazed that she just didn't at that point think, oh, maybe I just haven't taken a close enough interest in all of this stuff and just got it all out the way and corrected it. I know she's very, very busy.
It's whether it's a question of honesty, though, I suppose, as well. I mean, we're being quite generous to her. Maybe she was dishonest.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, in life, she's not going to be the first, person who's slightly exaggerated, her own greatness and her achievements and all the rest of it. It's always humiliating when this stuff comes out. You pay your money, takes your choice whether you think this is the worst crime in the world.
It feeds into what we've been talking about. Everybody accepts that everybody's a human being and there are failings. We all have our frailties. But actually, if you think back over the conversation we've had between the three of us over the last half an hour, a lot of it boils down to trust and honesty. What President Trump said about how that war in Ukraine started was dishonest, and it follows a pattern of statements that are not seen to be truthful. Robert was talking there about the assisted dying bill and how part of the reason that the conversation in this country is as it is because there's been trust lost in politicians and institutions. This sort of stuff does not help. It only feeds that sense of, well, nobody's telling the truth, nobody's being honest, why should we trust them on this? And, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because you don't want to sound too sort of petticoat straightening and absolutely outrageous. But these things do matter. And that's why people are held up to a greater level of scrutiny when they're in positions of trust and responsibility.
Everything, our digital histories are there for everyone to read, right? Whether it's a ridiculous tweet that you've put out when you were 18, we've seen plenty of politicians come a cropper with those, or other world leaders come a cropper with those, or whether it's your CV that's recorded on LinkedIn these days. I mean, most of this stuff would never have been discovered 30 years ago because the CV that you'd use to apply for a job would be in the bin by that point, and no one would be able to find the hard copy of it. So it's really difficult these days when there are so many digital footprints. I just wonder whether you've ever come a cropper, Emma, or anyone who's come a cropper?
I mean, obviously, I've never spoken an ill word in my life. Although I did notice that I had actually not looked at my LinkedIn for so long that I was still North of England correspondent, and I stopped being North of England correspondent in, I think, 2012.
Apparently, it's all the rage now. LinkedIn, it's the new thing. It's taking off.
Like that internet thing that's going to catch on as well. Yeah,
that sounds ancient now. Yeah,
it is catching people out all over the world.
Robert,
I think what I would say is, look, I have always been genuinely, and if anybody knows different, please do get in touch. But I do find the fact that her CV on LinkedIn or on Who's Who, were wrong, bizarre, because I have a different kind of role, but I've always been absolutely neurotic about making sure that what I put down there is 100% accurate.
I know someone actually who applied for a job claiming to have had this, absolutely incredible CV with some awesome experience at a previous company. They got offered the job and then they said, we want a reference. And at that point, no reference was able to be provided, which was an incredibly embarrassing situation to have to say, actually, I lied and I can't give you a reference. So, these things do happen. But
did they get the job or did they get kicked out?
They definitely did not get the job at that point. But if you're a politician, you've got to play by even stricter rules, in my view, because there's so much scrutiny of you. Robert, Emma, thank you so much. That's all we got time for this week. Thanks again to Robert and to Emma for making her debut on Talking Politics. Thanks to all of you for listening and watching. Don't forget to send your questions to us, talkingpolitics@itv.com. And if you're enjoying the show, hit subscribe, give us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us. From all of us here, though, on Talking Politics. Until next time, goodbye.